Hey, welcome. Thank you for joining me this evening for this webinar, Epigenetics and Constitution. But I'm really excited to be talking about this topic. I became aware of this some years ago, and it's an intriguing subject to me because it says a lot to me about the benefits of natural health. So, um, I, I first of all want to talk about I like science fiction. My favorite genre of both movies and fiction is science fiction. And one of the things that I've read a lot in science fiction is about the idea of, genetic engineering and being able to create these like, a super amazing human beings who would be like so awesome because you'd genetically set them up so that they would not have their teeth decay and they would be superiorly intelligent and and physically stronger and all that sort of thing. um, and this is because for a while it was really widely believed by science that in things like intelligence and athletic ability and health were primarily determined by genetics. In fact, this is still a very prevalent belief because we have this idea that certain people are born with really special talents and abilities like the young Mozart or whatever, or they're just born blessed with better athletic ability or physical health or these kinds of things. Well, while it's true that there are some physical traits that are passed on to offspring from parents, the whole notion that it's genetics has basically been disproven. And this whole subject of epigenetics is causing a real turnaround in the whole way genetics are viewed. So you may have a family history of heart disease or some other problem, but that does not mean that you're predisposed to it. So in order to understand what epigenetics is, we first of all have to go and talk a little bit about what genes are and what they do. So genes are the blueprints for creating proteins. So basically, they're like a set of plans for assembling different proteins. And proteins are the building blocks of all cellular structures, and they're also the building blocks of all. So they're the building blocks of cellular structures and processes, and they uh, basically uh, create enzymes to do you know, uh, biochemical transformations and also to create different structures, allow cells to move and so forth. So from DNA, the body creates RNA, and then from RNA, the body is able to sequence amino acids to become proteins. So um, DNA consists of strings of deoxyribose, which is a sugar, which are attached to nucleic acid. And there are only four nucleic acids. Uh, uh, Adenine, uh, I'm never good at pronouncing this stuff, cystosinine, guanine, and thymine, which are abbreviated ACGT. And each one of these can only be bound to one other type. So A and T go together and C and G go together. And that's basically all DNA is this sequence of pairs of these nucleic acids, and an A can only be bonded to a T, and a C can only be bonded to a G. Now, from that, the DNA can be replicated because only one nucleic acid can match to another nucleic acid. If you split apart the strands of the DNA, then you basically can duplicate the strand and make an exact copy of it. And there are actually enzyme systems in the cell that actually prevent mismatching so that you can get an exact copy of this blueprint for organizing proteins. So RNA is similar to DNA, but it uses the base of a sugar called ribose to attach to the nucleic acids. And one of the nucleic acids, thymine, is replaced with ursyl, which is abbreviated as a U. So what happens is the body goes in and it it unwinds the DNA and makes a RNA copy of it, which is like making a photocopy of the DNA that then is transported out of the nucleus of the cell to ribosomes, where it's used as a transcript for making the proteins. So each sequence of 3 of these RNA nucleic acids codes for a different amino acid. So as the ribosome reads the 3 different nucleic acids, it says, okay, this means we need to add to this chain this particular amino acid. So UUU or UUC means add phenylalanine, and AUG add methionine, and a number of ones add valine or so forth. So basically, these little things are read, and like I said, this whole thing is a building block for stringing together amino acids. So basically, this is a little illustration from Wikipedia. The DNA comes out and makes a copy of it with the RNA, and then the RNA goes out into the ribosome, and basically as it goes through and it reads the transcript, it then basically assembles the proteins by splicing together the different amino acids. This is actually a chart from Wikipedia. You can go on the Wikipedia and outline it, that shows the combination of the 3 different nucleic acids and which of the amino acids they code for, so that it tells the body what amino acids to add to the string. So what's really amazing about amino acids and proteins is that as soon as this long string of amino acids is put together, sort of like those old pop beads that you have for little kids, that you have different colors of pop beads and you string them together, and they kind of are a little bit flexible and bend. Well, that's basically what you've got with these strings of amino acids. They have certain electrical charges that cause them to fold onto each other and form these 3-dimensional structures and shapes. And this is what creates these proteins that basically become part of the cell's function and structures. So as electrical charges are changed within the protein can alter shape, or it can basically alter another chemical compound, either by splicing 2 chemical compounds together to synthesize compounds, or breaking 2 chemical compounds apart to break compounds down. So everything in the body that gets done through these amazing proteins that are created from these amino acid building blocks. So before they mapped the genome, what scientists believe is that because there were about 120,000 proteins found in the human body, then they figured there were probably 120,000 genes that would then, each gene would code for making a particular protein. So, that means that, in order to have a particular protein in the body, you would then have to have the right gene in order to be able to make that protein. Well, guess what? They found out that that wasn't true. There's only about 25,000 genes in the human genome. And what was even more surprising is the vast majority of these, 98% of them, do not code for creating proteins. They don't even know exactly what they're there for. So only a tiny fraction of the whole genetic code is used to make all of the 120,000 proteins that are synthesized by the human body. So what that means is that the body isn't just taking one gene equals one protein. It's actually selectively reading pieces of this blueprint and splicing different pieces together to make different proteins. So the whole process of what's going on in the genes is much more complicated than people actually believed it was. And so what's regulating how these genes get utilized is called the epigenome. And so now they're really, really busy trying to map the epigenome. So what epi is above, so it's called the epigenome because it's above or on top of the genes. And the epigenome basically contains markers that tell you where to stop and start reading the genes. And the epigenome is able to turn genes off, turn genes on, upregulate, meaning use that gene more often, or downregulate, meaning use those genes less often. So it's this epigenome that's determining how the cell goes in and reads the genes to make whatever proteins it needs to do whatever it's going to do. So that's what the epigenetics is all about. So one of the functions of epigenetics is cell differentiation. So as we all, I think, know, when the sperm and the egg come together and it forms the first living cell that makes us, then the entire genetic code for every tissue of the body is found in that cell, which includes brain cells and blood cells and muscle cells and bone cells and etc. So as those cells multiply and grow, it is an epigenetic process that basically starts causing certain cells to make certain kinds of proteins and in order to form specialized tissues and functions, which is, in other words, turning on some genetic material and then turning other genetic material off so that cells begin to differentiate. And so this is one of the functions of epigenetics, is so that even though every cell in the body contains the genes to basically make any kind of cell that's in the body, the epigenetics start altering in the individual cells to tell certain cells only to create utilize the parts of the gene that make red blood cells, and other ones white blood cells and bone cells and nerve cells and so forth. So what it turns out is that the brain of the cell is not the nucleus. The brain of the cell, the part of the cell that has intelligence and basically controls how the cell functions and sends signals into the nucleus to tell what genes to utilize and what genes not to utilize and what proteins to make and what proteins not to make, is the cell membrane. So years ago, I heard a Dr. Hugo Rodier, who's a holistic medical doctor in Salt Lake, talk about this. And he said, so what scientists did is they confused the brain for the gonads. The nucleus is just the gonads. It's the reproductive function. The brain is the cell membrane. And of course made a joke that that's not the first time people have done that. But anyway, the cell membrane is basically looking at the environment that the cell is finding itself in, and then sending chemical signals into the genes to activate certain epigenetic factors to make the proteins that are required to deal with what the environment is presenting that cell. So what epigenetic research is saying is that the foods we're eating, the lifestyle we're living, and probably even our thoughts and our feelings are influencing how our genes are expressing themselves, because it is the environment that's determining how the genes are getting read. So one of the people who studied this was Bruce Lipton, who wrote a book on this called The Biology of Belief, because basically he came to the conclusion that that it was also thoughts and emotions that were influencing how the cells function. But in his book, The Biology of Belief, he said, when I provided a healthy environment for my cells, he's talking about growing cells in the laboratory, they thrived. And when the environment was less optimal, the cells faltered. When I adjusted the environment, these sick cells revitalized. But most cell biologists knew nothing of the wisdom of tissue culture techniques, and scientists moved sharply away from considering environmental influences after discovering DNA's genetic code. In other words, what he's saying is that when they started to believe that health was coming from the genes and started to want to figure out ways to alter the genes. And by the way, picked up several books on epigenetics, and almost all of them are dealing with now trying to influence how you can create drugs to influence the epigenome to turn genetic expressions on and off and all that sort of stuff. So they're still ignoring the fundamental principle that it is primarily the cell's environment that is determining how that cell is growing. So there's been this argument for a long time. Are the personality traits that we have, the attributes we have, the abilities we have determined by nature, meaning what our genes gave us to work with, or are they determined by nurture, by the environmental influences, by how we're raised, by what we're fed, by how our parents treat us, and so forth? Well, it turns out that it's a combination of both. Like so many things, it's not an either-or situation. It's actually an interaction between the genetics that we're given and the nurture, or the environment that genetics is put into, which alters how the genetics express itself. Now, what's really fascinating about epigenetics is that it turns out that there's evidence that epigenetic information is transferred from parent to offspring. Now, back when the theory of evolution was first advanced, people believed that, and the original theory of evolution was based on this idea, that if I had to do something in the environment in order to survive, that I would alter how I expressed a trait to my offspring so that over time genetic structures would modify. Now, most people don't realize this, that there was a lot of things that were proposed in the original theory of evolution that were proven to be completely scientifically inaccurate, and even though that hasn't altered the fact that most people still believe that in an evolutionary process. But it turns out that epigenetic information is transferable, meaning as we, through our diet and lifestyle and whatever, either adjust our diet and lifestyle or in a healthier direction or in a less healthy direction, we pass epigenetic information onto our offspring, meaning we upregulate or downregulate different genetic expressions in our offspring based on the adaptations that we make in our diet and lifestyle. So our environment, nurture, modifies our genetic expression, which is then passed on to our children, who then further modify that genetic expression and so forth, so that there is an interaction or interplay between nature and nurture that is taking place. Now, this isn't altering the genes themselves. It's altering the way the body uses the genes to create different kinds of traits, which is really fascinating. And one of the reasons why I particularly find this fascinating is because long before I heard of epigenetics, I constructed this model of disease and cure. This has been the approach and how I have thought about illness and healing for over 2 decades. What I have always believed is that the disease, i.e., the pattern of imbalance and discomfort or lack of ease in the body, which is manifested as a bunch of symptoms of pain or inflammation or whatever, is created from the interplay of a person's constitution, which is what nature gave them to work with, which is what we're talking about when we talk about genetics. We're talking about the nature part of the equation of what we were born with versus the environment that we find ourselves in. And that when the environment we find ourselves in stresses our genetic ability to cope with that, it gives rise to symptoms of disease. And so the remedy is always finding what will harmonize that, what will either support or strengthen or assist our constitution or our genetics in giving a more balanced expression to our genes, or what will alter the environmental factors that are stressing our body. And so I've always considered constitution, or at least since the 80s, constitution a really, really critical factor to take into account in terms of how I'm looking at how to help someone. In other words, I'm not just interested in the disease they have, the symptoms I have. I'm interested in what's going on in their life. What is their diet? What is their lifestyle? What are their mental attitudes? What is going on in their relationships, their life? And also interested, well, and who is this person? Genetically, who is this person? What did nature give them to work with? And it's from looking at those two factors that I can come up with a plan to try to help improve their health, i.e. the remedy to make things happen. So let's look at a little bit more about epigenetics, because I think epigenetics really validates this model as being a very, very accurate way of looking at health and disease. So this is a quote from a book on this subject. When a gene product is needed, a signal from the environment activates that gene. So in other words, the body there's an environmental stress out there, and the cell membrane goes and says, go to the genetic material and make something to help us cope with this. Here are the factors that we know that are going to actually signal to our genes to alter the way those genes are expressing themselves. First is our diet, the nutrients we're taking. The foods we're eating are altering, sending messages to our cells to alter the way our genetics express themselves. Our lifestyle is also doing that. For example, exercise does that. When the whole point of exercise is that if I go out and I lift weights or I run or I do something, I'm placing a demand on the body, and the body then goes, because the environment is now demanding certain things out of my bones and muscles, that sends signals to the bones and muscles to go into the genes and assemble the right proteins in order to deal with that environmental stress and strengthen the body in order to be able to cope with that. Same thing's true of education and training. If I go and I do things to train my mind, I study something, I seek to master a particular thing, that also works in my brain, that the brain cells involved in that kind of a task send signals in to go and activate that. So for example, I read in a little bit of study of this epigenetics that they studied cab drivers in New York, and they did some research with them, and they found that cab drivers who'd been driving cab for a long time in New York, that the part of their brain that deals with what's called spatial reasoning, which is the ability to picture in your mind a map of where things are, was bigger than the average person. In other words, the demand placed on having to think about where you're going and where you're driving and whatever caused the part of the brain that does that to grow bigger. So education and training alters the way your genes express themselves in your cells. Same thing with choice of any activities that you do. that is altering the way your genes express themselves. Now, chemicals are doing this. Environmental toxins are going to alter our genetics. They're going to basically make our genes express themselves in different ways. And Bruce Lipton in The Biology of Belief says that this is also true of our mental attitudes and our emotional states and our beliefs. In other words, it's not just the physical things that are altering that. It's what we're thinking and what we're feeling and so forth, and the beliefs that we hold that are also sending signals to our genes to basically upregulate or downregulate different processes to with our health. So one of the things that we look at in this whole thing of epigenetics is something that is really something I've observed and that got me into doing emotional healing work. What I call emotional healing work is that environmental influences will trigger epigenetic changes that basically cause what we think of as an inherited disease to manifest. So this isn't just emotional, this is also physical. But say we know, for example, that people maybe have a genetic disposition to cancer or heart disease or diabetes or Crohn's or mental illness, because we know that these problems tend to run in families. And even if you're an adopted child, you still may have some of the tendencies to have some of the same kind of disorders as your actual real parents. So in other words, it's not all nurture. There's some genetic thing. But typically people who have the genetic tendency, say for celiac disease, which is this intolerance to gluten, it doesn't come on right away from the moment they're born. At some point in their life, something triggers it and suddenly it starts activating and flaring up. So in other words, there's something that happens to the body that triggers a change in the way the epigenetics is working with the genes that triggers that latent inherent tendency to come to the forefront. And this can include a traumatic life event. In other words, a really stressful event that suddenly put a really heavy demand of stress on the body that basically caused that epigenetic trigger. Or it could be nutritional deficiencies. In other words, the fact that you aren't getting enough of certain nutrients basically will cause certain genes to upregulate or downregulate, which is going to alter the way the genes express and bring disease to the forefront. Another one is, of course, exposure to environmental toxins and of course, general poor health habits. So I've been teaching for years that the three root causes of disease are mental and emotional stress, nutritional deficiencies, exposure to toxins, and trauma or physical injury, and that these things interact with the person's constitution to trigger the process of disease starting in the body and cause it to happen. So again, I think epigenetics is really validating this whole model of illness that I've put together. So let's give a couple of practical examples here. The first one is cancer. Now, years ago, I read that basically cancer cells are cells that trigger back to the same state that they were in the pre-embryonic tissue when the cells were undifferentiated. In other words, remember that all of the cells started off having exactly the same genetics and being exactly the same, and that then through epigenetic regulation, they all differentiated and became the different cells. So there's some evidence that environmental triggers will cause cells to revert to that very primitive metabolism where they grow really fast, they work off of a fermentive metabolism and so forth, and they change to that. So there are epigenetic, there are genes that basically suppress that initial cell function. Remember that cause the cells to start differentiating and no longer acting like the cells were when the sperm and egg first came together and they started dividing. So histones can turn these genes off, causing the cell to mutate and become cancerous. So in other words, there are certain compounds that will come in and knock that gene, that epigenetic information that's suppressing that primitive function of the cell out, causing that primitive function of the cell to revert back to its very primitive state, and thereby causing the cell to become cancerous. So one of the reasons why foods like broccoli and cruciferous vegetables, garlic and onions, all contain substances that act as histone inhibitors, and this helps keep these cancer blocking genes active. So in other words, there have to be epigenetic triggers in the diet and the lifestyle and so forth, that when the cell environment gets to a certain point at which it's so disrupted that the cell can no longer function as a normal, healthy, differentiated cell, then these things go in and switch off the genes that are suppressing the primitive function, and that primitive function comes to the forefront. So that's what's happening in cancer. Here's another example of what we're understanding from epigenetic research. Mental health. Okay, so you maybe have a tendency in your family to have some depression, or run, schizophrenic, or have high anxiety, or these sorts of things. But typically, they don't happen until you suffer a very, very deep traumatic trauma. So something happens and you feel extremely abused and extremely traumatized and so forth, and basically that creates epigenetic changes in the way the cells are accessing genetic material, which can cause things like changes in the way the DNA uses methylation, which can then cause you to become overmethylated or undermethylated, and those epigenetic changes that have been triggered by the trauma or abuse will change your brain chemistry, making your brain chemistry be not function as well, then causing things like mental illness or depression. And these same triggers can also cause general poor health. I've yet to observe a person who has multiple serious health problems who did not suffer some kind of severe abuse and trauma as a child. And so again, there appears to be these environmental things that then trigger these changes that give rise to the disease. And so the whole process is this combination of what we have in our genes coupled with the environmental influences. So methylation is just one of the chemical processes that goes on in the body, and it's used in all kinds of things. It's used in liver detoxification. It actually helps to regulate the epigenome. It's used in the brain. It's basically a process of adding methyl groups to certain compounds. So here's a study. And this study shows you how this works. Okay, so they did a study and they found that rats who received a great deal of physical attention from their mothers as babies, in other words, their mothers licked them a lot and they snuggled up with them a lot and everything, produced in their brains more receptors for cortisol. So when you're stressed, your brain sends a message to your hypothalamus, which sends a message to your pituitary, which sends a message to your adrenals to produce cortisol. And as the cortisol comes up in the blood, the cortisol receptors in the brain say, oh, okay, there's cortisol in the blood, and they shut that down so that they stop sending the signal to the adrenals to produce cortisol. In other words, it's a feedback loop. And so by having more cortisol receptors in the brain, that means that the stress response shuts off more quickly. So when those little, baby rats as adults are under a stressful situation because that epigenetic factor of having received more cuddling and nurturing as children caused their cells in their brain to produce more cortisol receptors. They don't get as high a production of stress hormones in stressful situations as rats who didn't get that attention. So perhaps you might have a problem with anxiety, and that problem with anxiety could be because because you had a lot of stress in childhood and you didn't get a lot of affection and so forth. There were epigenetic changes in your brain that made you more prone to having that kind of anxiety, that higher level of anxiety. So methylation, as we mentioned earlier, is one of the processes that's used to deactivate genes. So epigenetic changes can cause some people to overmethylate, which means to overly suppress genetic activity, and other people to undermethylate, which causes genetic activity to be overexpressed. And that can actually change the way a person processes individual nutrients. So for example, there are epigenetic changes that will cause people to burn through vitamin B6 and zinc extremely rapidly. And since vitamin B6 and zinc are used to produce calming neurotransmitters in the brain, that means they're prone to much higher levels of anxiety. So in order for them to calm down, they need much higher levels of vitamin B6 and zinc than an ordinary person does to counterbalance that tendency in the way their genes are expressing themselves inside their cells. So that's why you can't say this is the perfect diet for everybody, because you have to look at the person's constitution and you have to adjust the diet, the herbal program, all the things you do to fit their constitution, to help balance out their constitution. That's why you cannot treat the same illness the same way in person to person, because you always have to take into account the constitution or how the genes are expressing themselves in a particular individual as a factor. Okay, here's another epigenetic experiment. And this is an epigenetic experiment showing how nutrients can actually overcome a genetic condition by altering epigenetic regulation factors in how the genes are expressing themselves. So they took two groups of pregnant mice with a gene that produces yellow fur and also causes the mice to have a tendency to have obesity and diabetes. So this gene makes fat diabetic mice with yellow fur. So they took two groups of these mice with this gene, and they fed one group a diet rich in B vitamins, particularly folic acid and vitamin B12. And the other group of genetically identical mice, pregnant mice, these are pregnant mice, got no extra prenatal nutrition. Now, these B vitamins act as methyl donors, and they cause methyl groups to attach more frequently to that gene in the womb, thereby epigenetically downregulating the expression of this gene. The result was that the group fed the B vitamin, the mothers were fed the B vitamins, produced normal, healthy brown mice with normal weight and no propensity to diabetes. In other words, by having really good nutrition during pregnancy, you can improve the genetic expression of your offspring so that you're down-regulating harmful genes and and causing better regulation of genes. This is, by the way, some information I got, and I'm not going to go through all of it, about people who tend to genetically be overmethylators or undermethylators, which is a big factor in a lot of mental and emotional problems. It can be a factor in depression, a factor in schizophrenia, and so forth. This over or under methylation. So this is a constitutional. This is what we mean by constitutional. In other words, there's a pattern here in the way the genes are expressing themselves, okay, that gives rise to certain physical and emotional / behavioral tendencies, and also certain illness patterns. And that's what the traditional idea of constitution is in all systems of herbalism, is these patterns of certain physical characteristics coupled with certain personality characteristics and the tendencies towards certain imbalances in the body. That's what a constitutional factor is. And so you look at the constitutional factor, and then you find a way to help to balance out that constitutional factor to keep a person healthy and keep them from getting sick. So, for example, overmethylators and undermethylators both tend to have obsession, but overmethylators, their thoughts are obsessive, but they don't have compulsive actions like undermethylators do. Overmethylators tend to have a lot of body hair, undermethylators sparse body hair, overmethylators low sex drive, undermethylators high sex drive. Overmethylators have low motivation, are not competitive, but are more artistic and talkative, whereas undermethylators tend to have a very high libido, be very strong-willed, very competitive in sports and games. Overmethylators tend not to have seasonal allergies, undermethylators do. High anxiety is a common thing in overmethylators. Phobias or which are fears of things that aren't really dangerous, are found in undermethylators. Tendencies to sensitivities to food and chemicals on the overmethylation side, undermethylation, addictive tendencies, and so forth. So overmethylators respond well to folate supplements, but so if they have depression, giving them folate supplements might help, whereas if you give them SAMe, it'll make them worse. Undermethylators, you give them SAMe, they'll likely get better. Give them folate, they'll likely get worse. So this is, again, why it's impossible to just say, oh, here's the cure for depression, because you can have depression in undermethylators and depression in overmethylators, and the cure is going to be balancing out their constitution. It's not curing the disease, it's creating a balance between the environmental factors and the constitution. I hope this is making sense. So years ago, when I started having kids, I really firmly believed, and it's funny, I don't know where I got this idea, but I really firmly believed that if you wanted to have healthy offspring, it was really important for both the mother and the father to get on a really healthy diet and make sure that they're not using any kinds of harmful chemicals, maybe do a cleanse or whatever before they conceived, and basically that it would produce healthier offspring. And I actually took that approach along with good prenatal nutrition, and really was very concerned about helping my wives when they were pregnant to be as calm as possible and feel as safe and secure as possible, and so forth, because I've always believed that the quality of the sperm and the egg depend on the general health of the mother and the father, that's going to be a factor in determining having healthy offspring. And prenatal nutrition is also going to be a factor in healthy nutrition. And we actually had some pretty healthy kids. And epigenetics is suggesting that this is actually real. If you want to have healthy kids, number one, both parents should do a cleanse before they even think of conceiving, and get on a really good nutritional program and get their bodies in a really good state of health, because if they do, they're going to pass on better genetic expression to their offspring by doing that. And then the mother, of course, paying good attention to good prenatal nutrition is going to pass on healthier genetic expressions to the offspring. And so this is one of the things that I think epigenetics is showing is the importance of doing this. This is some quotes on this particular topic. In the 1980s, one of the people who studied this, Dr. Lars Bergen in Stockholm, said that conditions in the womb can affect your health not only when you were a fetus, but well into adulthood. And then an article in the Lancet journal showed if a pregnant woman ate poorly, her child is at greater risk for cardiovascular disease as an adult. In other words, just eating poorly while you're pregnant increases the risk of cardiovascular disease in your child when they become an adult, because it's setting up epigenetics that are going to be more prone to disease instead of to health. Now, this thing that he says about conditions in the womb not only affect your health, this is because I've done a lot of work with emotional healing work. I've gone back and in the emotional healing work found out things that, like when what was happening with the parents and the mother and her emotional state in the womb. I found that affecting a child physically and emotionally into adulthood. Which is, again, why I think that, ideally, it's nice if you can plan for a child and have a peaceful pregnancy. It doesn't always happen, and there are ways of going back and fixing this. But the point is that there is this environmental influences that are taking place on genetics, even in the womb. Now, one of the things that adversely affects epigenetics is smoking. They did this study where they took 166 fathers who smoked before the age of 11 and showing that smoking caused epigenetic changes in the way their genes express themselves. Now, the sons of these 166 fathers who had smoked before the age of 11 had higher rates of obesity and heart disease and shorter lifespans because their fathers had smoked. So that epigenetic information that led to a weaker constitution was passed on to their offspring. And this was published in the European Journal of Human Genetics in 2006. So if you think about using drugs and a lot of chemicals and toxins, the scary thing about this is look at what we're doing, with drugs and alcohol and vaccines and all the chemicals and things we've got in our environment, and all the poor diet and the high sugar content of people's diets and the low nutritional content of people's diets. Our offspring are becoming weaker, and they are, unless they really work hard to clean up their act, their offspring will be even weaker, because there is an epigenetic transfer of negative as well as positive information. Here's another one. Mice fed GMO soy had changes in testicles suggesting possible problems with sperm cells, and embryos of mice fed GMO soy had changes in DNA expression compared to those whose parents were fed natural soy. 56% of rats whose mothers were fed genetically modified soy died within 3 weeks, compared to 9% of those with mothers who ate non-GMO soy. After the study was completed, the rat food used by that laboratory began incorporating GMO soy, and within 2 months, infant mortality rocketed above 50%. So again, another thing, what are we doing with GMOs? How are they going to affect our epigenetic regulation, and so forth? I don't know. This was several years ago, and there may be some other studies that I need to get into some of my more current books on genetic modifications. But this one was a study that was published showing that genes inserted into soybeans to make them herbicide tolerant, in other words, to make them handle Roundup Ready, transferred into the DNA of gut bacteria and became a stable part of their DNA, which meant that long after you stop eating a GMO food, your gut bacteria could still be producing these foreign proteins. including the possibility of producing the pesticide that, because one of the GMOs is to produce a pesticide within the plant, and that gene can transfer into your gut bacteria and cause your gut bacteria to start producing that pesticide. So this means that eating a GMO corn chip could theoretically turn your intestinal flora into a living pesticide factories for the long term. And again, how is this going to modify human genetics? Here's some things that were done with a longitudinal study of parents and children. Baby lotions containing peanut oil may be partially responsible for the rise in peanut allergies. High maternal anxiety during pregnancy is associated with a child later developing asthma. There's an epigenetic thing. The mother's anxious, that environment of anxiousness transfers into the genetics of how the genetics of the child express themselves. So the child has a tendency towards higher anxiety, and little kids who are kept too clean have higher risk for eczema, and so forth. Here's another one. This is about the thoughts. One of the epigenetic researchers said, contrary to what many people are being led to believe, we are free to make decisions that impact our lives and those of others. Our beliefs change our biology. We have the power to heal ourselves, increase our feeling of self-worth, and improve our emotional state. In other words, just the thoughts we adopt, the beliefs we adopt, the so forth, are going to influence how our genes express themselves. So if we believe that we're sickly, if we believe that we're, you know, having all of these, like that we're prone to certain thing, like one of the things that you'll see is, someone, because they had a parent die of cancer at a certain age, as they get close to that age, they're worried that they're going to get cancer and die too. And that worry and fear will contribute to, making them ill and getting them possibly to get cancer too. So the emotional and mental aspect of this is really critical too. So if you want to love your genes, and have your genes express themselves in a more healthy way, and also pass on, for those of you who are younger, a healthier genetic expression to your offspring, you want to start with good nutrition. Especially B vitamins are really important in epigenetic regulation. Antioxidants are important as well. Probiotics, making sure that eating fermented foods, doing things to help maintain a healthy gut flora. The gut flora have a huge impact on how our immune system functions. And we're only beginning to understand all of that. Using kind of traditional tonics or adaptogens as herbs that, have a historical, use in different cultures as being foods and tonics that promote general health and improve overall vitality and so forth. Avoid toxins, drugs, smoking, alcohol, and chemicals. Exercise, again, exercising is an environmental factor that causes your body to mount responses to strengthen itself so that it is more resilient. The same thing was true with your mind. The more you exercise your mind by becoming a lifelong learner and staying mentally active and doing things that challenge your abilities, the more your mind responds by creating proteins and whatever and making you more intelligent. In fact, I don't remember if I put a slide in there on talent, but if I'm going to make a mental note to make sure I talk about the whole issue of talent here. I'm not going to talk about it at this point, but right there, learning to cope with stress, and then also watching your attitudes and working to heal past emotional trauma. So this idea of constitution, okay? All traditional systems of medicine incorporate the idea of constitutional types. This is something that has been in the tradition of herbalism and healing for thousands of years is that there are constitutional types. And when you are dealing with health, you have to look at the constitution of the person you're dealing with. You can't just look at the disease they have or the symptoms they have. You have to look at the person who has the disease, because that helps you understand the disease. Like I said, that model that I showed you in the beginning, that constitutional factors together with the lifestyle or environmental factors is what gives a picture of an understanding of why this person is sick. So a constitutional type can include like a physical structure. Some people are more petite and tiny. Some people, are more big, bony and muscular, and so forth. That's part of the idea of constitution. You have a certain kind of basic physical appearance. There is also, with the idea of constitution, tendencies to certain physical strengths and weaknesses. In other words, all constitutions have strengths, and all constitutions have potential weaknesses that go with those strengths. And this is always tied in with personality tendencies. So this is a very interesting factor, that constitution is not just about the physical thing, but it's also your psychological profile as well. And so that also suggests, again, that there's a tie-in between mental and emotional state and what's going on physically in the body as well. So these traditional constitutional types are often linked to basic energetic models. So they were talked about using metaphors. So for instance, a person might be in the traditional Western thing, a constitution that has more air or more water or more fire or more earth. And so in Western herbalism, you had the sanguine, which was the air constitution, the phlegmatic, which is the water constitution, the choleric, which is the fire constitution, and the melancholic, which is the earth constitution. And those four constitutional types all are prone to certain personality tendencies and also more prone to certain physical strengths and weaknesses, and also some physical characteristics. You have a similar thing going on in traditional Chinese medicine with the 5 elements of wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. You have in Ayurvedic medicine, you have the concept of constitutions with the tridoshas, the Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. You have Native American constitutional types, which were often compared to animals, like a bear type or a rabbit type or so forth. All of these, again, were metaphors of trying to describe certain basic tendencies that a person had, and then looking at that factor of the constitution and taking it into account to determine an approach to health. So I've been studying iridology since the 80s, and the I actually attended the first international Iridology conference in 1986, and in that conference, I heard Dr. Bernard Jensen give a talk on the iridology as he was presenting it, which was commonly the way iridology was done in the States at the time. And then I heard Bill Caradona and Harry Wolf talk about constitutional iridology, which made a lot of sense to me, that the iris wasn't telling you what diseases a person has. It was telling you about what kinds of strengths and weaknesses they were prone to in their physical vitality. In other words, there were certain genotypes in the iris that basically gave you a picture of what kinds of health problems a person was prone to. And at that same iridology conference, Denny Johnson came up, who had developed the Rayad model of iridology, which was a personality model of iridology, independent of anybody else in iridology, and presented emotional interpretations of all of these same iris signs. And I just was hooked, partly because I was fascinated at the relationship of, here's an iris sign that has a tendency to certain physical health problems, but that iris sign also indicates certain personality tendencies, and how are those personality tendencies and that tendency to certain illnesses mixed in together. So um, the biggest thing I've used for constitutional typing isn't the traditional constitutional typing systems, it's actually iridology, and I've actually tied a lot of these traditional constitutional types into iris constitutional types, which I rely on very heavily, which is the primary reason why I like iridology, because to me it's the best window on constitution that there is. But what's really interesting about iridology is this: the iridology model that I was initially exposed to before that conference in 1986 had this idea that the iris was reflecting the state of health of the body. And that's not true, because the iris is basically stable, pretty stable throughout your life, which is what iris biometrics is showing, that it's much like your fingerprint. It's a very stable thing that can be used for identification. But you have people who have these iris signs who they adopt healthier habits, and all of the symptoms that are the negative manifestations of that all disappear, and the iris sign is still there. In other words, they still have the latent genetic tendency towards certain health problems, but because they have altered their diet, their lifestyle, their environmental factors, they have downregulated those potential processes, and thereby are not causing them to become manifest. Whereas, so when I do iridology with people who eat healthy and blah, 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 it's not very predictive of what kind of illnesses they have. But when I'm doing iridology with someone who eats poorly and has really poor health habits, it becomes very predictive of the kinds of health problems they have, which again, perfectly matches this whole idea of epigenetics, that we have a certain genetic inheritance as part of our constitution, and then we have an environment that either upregulates or downregulates those basic traits that we were born with. And this also goes, so I'm going to talk right here about talents, because I should have put a slide in about this. You know, there's evidence that shows that anybody who invests 10,000 hours of dedicated practice into any skill where they're continually motivating themselves to improve their skill level will become a genius in that activity. 10,000 hours. So I've been writing my whole life, and I've always compelled to want to improve my writing. So I've become a very, very good writer. Now, my dad was a writer. I come from a family of writers. My dad loved poetry. My dad loved to write poetry. My dad had very good writing skills. So epigenetically, all right, the fact that my dad and his dad and so forth all wrote, and that my mom was also language was really important to her, I was probably born with a little bit of a tendency to, have writing ability. That gives me a little teeny one up maybe over someone who didn't have that ancestry. But then the fact that my nurture encouraged me to write, and so on and so forth, that developed that. Now, what's interesting is all my kids write. A lot of my kids write poetry too. So that gives you, a little bit of idea of how epigenetics may work with talents. So anyway, back to iridology. Iridology suggests that certain iris structures are indications for both physical strengths and weaknesses, the tendency to have certain health problems, or basic personality tendencies, which again have both strengths and weaknesses. The strengths and weaknesses depend on your environment, how you are utilizing that genetic tendency. So a lot of this then becomes dependent on how we choose to live. And the same thing's true for the basic personality tendencies. It's how we choose to deal with that basic tendency, that whether it turns into a strength or a weakness. And also, there are a lot of iridologists who've done studies like taking pictures of a grandparent's eyes and then their children's eyes, and then for a couple of generations, and you can see that in families where they've adopted healthy habits, there's an improvement in iris patterns of health and strength over succeeding generations. And the reverse is also true, where they haven't had good health, that then some of the iris signs that indicate tendencies to disease become worse in successive generations. Again, suggesting this kind of validity that iridology may be an epigenetic window. So for example, this area right at 3 o'clock in the left eye and at 9 o'clock in the right eye is the heart area in the iridology reflexive zone map. And in the physical aspect of iridology, it suggests a genetic family history of heart disease, which is very often true if the sign shows up in this eye. In the left eye, it would be a history of heart disease on the mother's side of the family. In the right eye, a history of heart disease on father's side of the family. But it also, in emotional interpretation of iridology, is a difficulty in making commitments, in committing the heart to relationships, a tendency to what we call wandering heart, to have a broken heart, to not be able to find real love and commitment in life. And so there is a physical trait and an emotional trait with that. Well, I think the beauty of understanding this whole idea of constitution is, if I know that I've inherited this tendency towards a weakness in an organ, I'm not doomed to have heart disease. I'm not doomed to have bad relationships, but I have to recognize that I've got a constitutional tendency towards that, and that I need to very consciously do things to work on that so as to balance out my constitutional tendencies, to ensure that I don't manifest those latent genetic tendencies, that I basically alter that genetic expression. So this is how I'm just explaining how I've been working with health. And I was doing this kind of work with health and looking at health this way because of my experience with iridology and traditional constitutional models long before I learned about epigenetics. Here's another interesting one: the kidney zone, which is at the bottom of the iris, right around 6 o'clock, leans a little in towards the nose. So there's a dark area and kind of separation of the fibers in the kidney zone in both of these irises. And on the physical level, this is a sign of a tendency towards weakness of the kidneys. Which this particular eye pattern, it's one of the major things this person would be prone to is weakness in the kidney area. So knowing that, even if they don't have kidney problems, even if they're a small child that's still relatively healthy, then we could do things that guide them towards a healthier lifestyle, to take better care of the kidneys, and upregulate kidney function with herbs that act as tonics to the kidneys, and avoiding things that stress the kidneys, and drinking plenty of water to keep the kidneys healthy, in order to prevent that from ever becoming an actual disease state. But we also can look at it and say, well, there's an emotional personality tendency that goes with, and that is that separation of fiber in the kidney area, for some reason, is also associated with a tendency to have gross motor skills. That is, to be good at sports, dance, that sort of thing, where you have good balance and coordination. So there's a gift involved in that, which I don't know why those two things are interrelated, but I found over and over again in people's eyes that it's true, that it's extremely accurate in that interpretation. These are my eyes. And I find it very interesting to look at my own, you know, iris pattern and what I'm prone to, because I had respiratory problems, uh, weakness of the sinuses and lungs in my early childhood, which is what drove me into emotional healing. Caught colds very easily, very tendency to be sick, and this zone here above 9 o'clock, going towards night about 9 and 10 o'clock in the right eye is the lung area, and in the left eye, it's between 2 and 3 o'clock. All right, in the iris, that area is the area of the lungs, and I definitely have a genetic tendency to weakness in the lungs. I mean, I live away from major metropolitan areas because whenever I have lived in major metropolitan areas where there's a lot of air pollution, I get sick really easily because I have this tendency towards a genetic constitutional weakness in my lungs, that stuff that other people might be able to cope with better, I have a very difficult time coping with. Same thing with cigarette smoke and so forth. Um, I can't cope with it. Emotionally, that area of the eye deals with nurturing. In it, uh, all those markings in that area of the eye suggest that I did not feel like I got the love and nurturing that I wanted when I was a child. That's what the personality chart says, and that's absolutely true. Neither one of my parents were very affectionate. They weren't even that affectionate with each other. You didn't see them holding hands. You didn't see them sitting next to each other, cuddling, that kind of thing. There just wasn't much affection in my family. And so that lung area uh, is somehow tied in with nurturing. It's where we hug. It's where we have this, warm, fuzzy feeling. So there are interplays between the emotional states and the physical conditions. And this shows up in the iris. And this is all part of what we're talking about with constitution. And I could tell you a lot of other things about myself using, my eye pattern, about my constitution, all of which are true, about what I'm prone to. The orange is a tendency towards blood sugar problems. And I definitely am very sensitive to refined carbohydrates, and I do much, much better when I just completely stay away from them. So again, coming back to this model, our constitution and our environment interact to create a state of health, and we pass this on. One study I forgot to put in here was um, they did a study where, and I really a little upset that I forgot about this one and didn't get some slides in about it. They did a study where they took three groups of mice, and one they put in a learning poor environment, the other one in sort of a mouse normal environment, and the other group in a learning rich environment. And then they measured the level of certain brain chemicals associated with learning and memory. And just as was predicted, the mice in the learning poor environment had lower levels of that chemical. The mice in the learning rich environment had higher levels of that chemical. And what was interesting is their offspring also had lower or higher levels of that chemical. But they also found that that could be changed by taking the mice that had been were the offspring of mice in the low learning thing and putting them in a learning rich environment, that it could start to elevate levels of those chemicals in their brain. So in other words, it's not a life sentence, but what our parents did, what our ancestors did, does influence what we come into this world with. And then it's up to us to take what we were given and either improve upon it or make it worse. And we are going to, do that whether we're conscious about our health or unconscious about our health. Now, I want to close with some interesting food for thought. All right. First of all, it intrigues me that there's 98% of our genetic material that isn't coding for proteins. What is that there for? And I wonder sometimes if we're not capable of doing things with our bodies and our health that we haven't even discovered yet? In other words, as human beings challenge themselves mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, is it possible that under certain conditions, some of this genetic material could be triggered into activity and we would be capable of achieving heights that we haven't achieved yet as human beings? Interesting thought. And with that comes the question of how much actual control does thought or consciousness have over genetics? In other words, like Bruce Lipton in The Biology of Belief, our mental and emotional attitudes do impact how our genes express themselves. And some of that is getting passed on to our ancestors, to our offspring. So how much is that influencing it? In other words, how much can human thought control the expression of genes? Now, Denny Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, who developed the RAD model of iridology, really got into this whole issue of that we come down through certain genetic streams, and that we basically are inheriting certain issues from our ancestors. And he actually has done a lot of research in this. And had some I took a class from him on this, and he had some fascinating stories to tell about this. But I have encountered in emotional healing work the concept of genetic memory, that, for example, it isn't just physical traits that tend to run in families. It's also behavioral patterns like alcoholism, and I've seen suicide running in families, and child abuse running in families, and there's that biblical idea of the sins of the fathers are visited on the heads of to the third and fourth generation of them that hate me. In other words, from the great grandparents or grandparents down to the fathers and mothers and children, there's an influence of, stress and trauma and other things influencing epigenetics and negatively influencing subsequent generations. And I know that's kind of a weird topic, but I absolutely guarantee that in the emotional healing work I've done, I've run into this. And I really believe that we do possess genetic memory, that somehow in the epigenetics, we're getting transferred certain information about coping traits, which may include coping with really negative mental and emotional trauma as well. Here's another really interesting question. Have human beings been gradually influencing plant genetics? Because this is Brassica oleracea, which is the same plant genetically. In other words, this is one species, and human beings over the course of a couple of thousand years have coaxed out of this one species broccoli, kale, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, and kohlrabi, all of which are really, really different plants, showing that same genetic material. Now, if these plants are left to kind of intermingle, they'll all just kind of go back into this generic plant. But we've bred multiple colors of cauliflower, kale, cabbage, all these different things out of this one genetic material. And is that partly because human intention, as you select plants, is also influencing epigenetic regulation, upregulating and downregulating certain genes, and that is getting transferred onto the offspring and causing certain traits to become more and more dominant with successive generations? And could we be doing the same thing with animals? Look at how many varieties of dogs and cats human beings have created. And we do this fairly rapidly within a few generations. So is it possible that our expectations and whatever are creating epigenetic alterations that are passing on to offspring? This, again, I said just is conjecture, food or thought. I happen to think it's very possible that we are, because I believe that consciousness has a huge impact on the physical world, and that we have far more power in our consciousness than most people believe that we do. Bottom line is, there's still a lot we don't know. But the big thing I want everyone to carry away from this, actually, the two big things are, one, that you you have to take into account a person's constitution when you're working up a program to help them with their health, because you've got to look at who this person is and kind of what their genetic inheritance is, and match that with the diet and lifestyle things to really understand an appropriate protocol for them. It's why I've always been frustrated when someone asks me how to cure a particular disease, because I don't have any standard protocol for any disease, really. I have basic ideas I do, but I modify them according to the constitutional lifestyle of the client when I'm working with them. And the second thing is that, okay, there is a family history of heart disease, or a family history of diabetes, or a family history of schizophrenia, or depression, or child abuse, or any of those things. Okay, it hasn't doomed you to have those problems, because you have the capacity, by consciously making different choices, by constantly adopting different belief systems, by consciously improving your diet, by consciously, studying and improving your mind, to create epigenetic changes that not only benefit you, but epigenetic changes that you can transfer to your offspring and help them transfer a better genetic thing to their offspring too. And that's, of course, the good news. The bad news is that I think overall in society, the vast majority of people are basically damaging and creating worse health for succeeding generations through epigenetics than they are better health. And so there's a big need for all of us to educate people and help them, turn things around, and realize that we're not just a product of our genes. We are a product of our lifestyle, and we're a product of our choices. And we, yes, there is a certain constitution that nature gave us to work with, but we are capable of improving on that, and making our health better in spite of what our genetics give us. So thank you all for participating and listening to this very, very important message tonight.